Okay, so let's go. Thank you everyone for joining me on this session about leveraging the Power Platform to rule Microsoft Teams self-service provisioning. Yet it's another session about provisioning and how to automate Teams provisioning, very close to what Vesa just demoed before me. But you'll see how you can mix all the ideas to match your requirements later. I'll start to introduce myself. I'm Théophile CHIN-NIN, French from Paris. I work as a Microsoft 365 architect at Abalone. My main topics are SharePoint, Teams, and everything related to the Power Platform. So I come from the SharePoint on-premises universe, and now I'm guiding organization on the way to Teams, and I really love using the Power Platform to apply governance on all Microsoft 365 tools. So let's talk a bit about governance, Teams governance, and Office groups governance, because as you know, each team is related to an Office group. And to talk about governance, I really like this slide that has been presented by Melissa Hubbard at SharePoint conference last year. On this slide, you can see, let's say, all the main topics of Office groups governance. So it's a good overview of what should be done before deploying Teams, and most widely Microsoft 365. So the first thing is naming convention. People are used to naming convention across their existing tools. You have some abilities to perform naming convention out of the box, but this is quite limited option. You can only use few Azure AD attributes of the group creator to perform naming convention. You cannot really add custom business value related to the Teams request, for example. So we'll see how we can improve that. From a governance perspective, it's a good thing to define who can create Office groups, because as the Office groups are the center of the collaboration in Microsoft 365, they have a lot of creation points. It can be SharePoint, it can be Teams, it can be Planner, for example, or Outlook. So it's a great thing to centralize Teams creation, so they don't spread all over your tenants and get out of control. The next step is expiration. So expiration can be configured by default on the tenant. It requires an Azure AD Premium license. This is a bit binary, so either all the groups are within the policy or none of the groups are in. You can also define which group should be in the policy, but it requires an admin action. So we'll see how we can automate this policy assignation for expiration. Why expiration? Just because there are a lot of groups created in the tenant. All are not in use, so we'd like to clean up the tenant, and the default expiration process is quite well done. Microsoft will require the approval of the main owner of the group, and it will soft delete the group, so the group is still recoverable 30 days after the deletion. The next step is one of the most important on group governance. It's about configuring guest access. So by default, all the group, well, if you configure guest access for your teams, all the groups can receive guests, so can be shared externally. If you want to specify which group should have guests or is allowed to have guests, you have to run an admin operation to perform this. So we'll see how we can use the team's request to define which team can have guest access. The next step is policies. Policies are going to be even more relevant in the next few months because of sensitivity labels policies for Office 365 groups. So I'm not going to talk a lot about these policies. The next one is the templates. They have already been very requested in the past, even through SharePoint site provisioning. So we used to build a provisioning solution to create sites with templates for business needs. So we will see how we can do the same thing here in Teams, so we can streamline our processes through the Teams creation. And the last one is also very important, is the monitoring. You have default option in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and you can provide custom solution based on Power BI, for example. So you can have reports on how many groups are used, which one are not, which one should be cleaned up, and how they are used. So you can provide even more information to end user to help them use Office Group with the best practices. So by default, there is no many ways to apply all these governance settings within Teams. So we will probably decide to go through a provisioning model, just as Vesa showed before me. So you have basically three kinds of provisioning models. The first one is the out-of-the-box service. So everyone can create a site, an Office group, through all the different tools, Outlook, Planner, SharePoint, Teams, Power BI, and so on. And the second one is we will apply a controlled self-service. So we will collect the request of creation and provide the creation without any approval, but with the way to apply custom configuration for Office Group. And the last one is the approval process. This is basically what showed Vesa just before me. So here are the different points for all these provisioning model. The first one is the ability to apply governance. If we use the self-service out of the box, we will not be really able to apply that governance. It will improve in the next few months. First of all, because of sensitivity labels for Office groups. So we will, out of the box, be able to assign sensitivity information, sensitivity labels to our groups, and then define if the groups can be public or private, or if it can be shared with guests. This is at the moment in public preview, so this is not usable now. The next thing that is going to be improved in the next few months is the expiration that will be based on the group activity. So we will be able to just assign the policy to all the groups, and the expiration date will be just renewed automatically based on the group activity. So this is for the out-of-the-box service. if we use a control subservice or an approval process for provisioning groups, we will be able to just apply whatever setting we want on the group. So this is really the main good side of these two provisioning model. The second point is how fast the end user will have access to his team. From the out-of-the-box service, it's really fast. They will have it in really few minutes. The objective is not to make this too long, because end user, when they need a team, they need it right now. So this is why I like the control subservice, because it just take few minutes. It's a bit longer than the out-of-the-box service, but it does not require day of approval and eventually bottleneck of approval. So the user can have his team right away. The next thing is the provisioning model will help us to control how the group spread across the tenant. If you use the out-of-the-box self-service, you are going to have a lot of groups created. It can be out of control, and this is why I recommend not to use the out-of-the-box service, just to control a bit how the groups are going to be created, and to make sure that you don't have, let's say, 3 or 4 groups just for one topic. The two last points are the integration and the templates. Obviously, the out-of-the-box service is very well integrated within Teams, but now with all the Teams apps and ability to extend the Teams interface, we can also integrate very well our custom solution into Teams. So I will show this a bit later. And from a template perspective, out of the box, we have the ability to create a team based on another one, but this is not the best way to provide templates. We can do it a better way by using a control provisioning service. So let's talk about the different settings we will be able to set through a provisioning control provisioning service. The first one are related to the office group. We will be able to define whatever we want as a naming convention for the group title. We will be able to set classification, and accordingly to this classification, we will be able to set the visibility option, public or private, and the guests, allowing guest option. I just think someone is unmuted. And we also will be able to configure the expiration policy for the office group. So as I said, the office group is related to a lot of tools, so we will have to apply configuration to some of the tools related to the office group. For example, in Outlook, we will be able to define our own mail nickname, which could be a very good thing. We will be able to define the visibility of the group in the Outlook clients and in the global address list. At the moment, with the out-of-the-box provisioning service, if you create your group in Teams, this group won't be visible in the Outlook client. But if you create your groups anywhere, any elsewhere, the group will be visible on the Outlook client. So maybe your user, they want to have team, but they also want to have the calendar in Outlook, for example. So we'll be able to control that. And we'll also be able to control the external sender setting. So making our group configured to receive external sender emails. From a SharePoint point of view, we will be able to configure the external sharing capabilities. This is related to the security option. It's not because you're disabling guest access on the group that the site cannot be shared externally. So you have to apply that setting twice. Once in the group settings to prevent adding guests, and on the other hand, on the SharePoint side to prevent sharing outside the organization. We will also be able to set the member sharing capabilities. By default, all members can share the site and all items in the site. In my opinion, only owners should be able to give new access to the site, access to the information. So we can also define this parameter automatically when a new team, a new group is provisioned. And of course, we will be able to apply templates, for example, to provide list, libraries, content types, folder hierarchy, and so on to the sites. From a team point of view, the provisioning service will be able to manage members, settings, channels, and tabs. So we'll be able to provide real templated teams in order to just streamline your business processes and make teams really support your business processes. And then from a planner perspective, we'll be able to create plan and add buckets and tasks. So for example, we'll be able to use a template planner to create a new team. So the user already have the task in the planner. So how are we going to do this? I'm using six main technologies. The first one is to collect the user's request, the user's data. So this will be done through Teams directly because it's the best way to provide Teams provisioning services. We're not going to ask them to go outside of Teams. We will directly integrate our Power Apps in Teams, so users can submit the Teams request directly in Teams, either in web clients or in the clients on your computers. Then we will use a SharePoint site to store all the requests and all the informations needed for the application to run, like templates and settings. Then we will use Power Automate to automatize the creation and schedule all the tasks and just orient the process on different ways of creations. And to really perform the operation, we will use Graph API. And when the Graph API is a bit limited, we will use some Azure function, for example, to set SharePoint site sharing settings and external sharing. What I want you to understand here is that using, for example, Azure function means that you can basically do whatever you want on your SharePoint. So the Azure function will use PNP, PowerShell for me, and we can do whatever we want, like applying PNP templates, for example, for the team site created with the teams. So here are an overview of the different technology I used in the solution with all the prerequisite and interaction. So first one, the SharePoint site is a communication site. I will use basic lists to store settings such as classification, visibilities, and templates. I will use request lists for the user to interact with, and I will have a created teams list so user can see which teams are created, for example. Then I will use Teams and Power Apps as an interface for the end users. So a Teams personal app directly pinned on the left menu that embed a Canvas app. So we will deploy Teams personal app on our tenant, and we will create a Canvas apps this kind of apps doesn't require premium license. So it can be done in pretty much all Office 365 plans. And then we will use the Power Automate to create and configure the team. This Power Automate will be triggered by the request list, and we will use an HTTP connector to make a request to the Graph API and to the Azure function. This connector requires a premium license, but as it's an automated triggered flow, your solution will only require the one premium license. You don't have to have premium licenses for all the users. And then from a permission perspective, we will have to give permission through Azure AD application registration. So basically it's service principals for Graph and SharePoint Online. So we'll use application permissions. There are a few operations that cannot be done with application permission. For example, all the planners interaction. So we will have to use delegated permission. And for this, we'll need a service account without MFA enabled. And then to interact with SharePoint, we will use the same Azure AD app registration plus a SharePoint app only tenant-wide permissions. I will move on to the demo. So from an end user perspective, they will be able directly into team to have this pinned application, custom application that can be pinned through app setup policies. This is basically a embedded Power Apps. This kind of approach can be used as well for adoption perspective. I initially built this solution. Why? Because on the different company I work for, I can see that a lot of people are creating test teams. And I think this is an opportunity to provide them best practices and materials to get familiar with the environment. So my idea is to allow one test team per person with pre-configured information inside the team. So we will do it right now. So I select the test team template. The application requires some information. For example, the work group. I will be able to say test teams test and the description. I will see that my email address is already defined and I cannot modify this. This is a way to have control over all the test teams created. Then we will have the configuration part. So we can see that for this template, you can only have the restricted data classification, and you can only have a private work group. So I will just go back and show you for other templates that we can have different data classification. And according to the classification, we can have different visibilities. So if I come back to my test team, I will be able to add different members as owner or as members. I will not do this here. And then I will click create. So I just have a confirmation screen. What is happening actually? you can see that I cannot create test team anymore. It looks like you have just requested your test teams. It will be available very soon. So what is just happening here is that the Power App has created a an item on my SharePoint list of requests, which is right here, test team fest. I have all the information that I've filled in. For example, the classification, the visibility, and the template. All this information are in separate lists. So you can manage all your templates, your visibility, and your classification right from SharePoint. For example, if I take the template list, I can see that I have the test template, and the test template has only one classification available. This is restricted. If I take the user group one, I will have confidential, public, and restricted. So from a classification perspective, you can see that my classification has available visibility. If I choose restricted or confidential, my teams can only be private, it cannot be public. So having this said, the item added to my SharePoint list, SharePoint request list, is going to start a Power Automate flow, which is running at the moment. So this is basically the same thing Vesa showed just before. So we have a lot of variables initialization. We have direct interaction with Azure Key Vault to store all our secrets for delegated permission and for the app secret. We will get all information of my setting list in SharePoint for the classification, the visibility, and the template. And then we'll start creating the team. So my flow just complete. I will just come back to teams so I can show you that I have two notification, and I can go back to my teams and see that I have the test team fest created with two channels, one for private and one for to explain why users should use private channels and channels to classify their information. And you can see that we have some of the tabs pre-configured here. You will have, first of all, a SharePoint page tab that will show what I called a learning center, which is basically a modern page with some videos and some learning material, so the user can directly in the test team have information on best practices and so on. And they will also have a planner to help them going through their teams and say, for example, try to add a new colleague, try to add a new owner, create channel. So all these tasks are created by the flow based on a template planner that I have somewhere on my tenant. I will go a bit deeper in the flow. So just as Vesa said before, we need to authenticate on the Graph API using an Azure AD application, which is right here for me. It's called Graph Team Management. It has all this permission consented by my global administrator. So permission on the Graph API and permission on SharePoint. And you can see that it has delegated permission and application permission. Just as I said before, the delegated permission are used to configure all the planners related parts and the Outlook allow external senders setting. Then, according to the choices made by the user, I will define some of the parameters. For example, if this group is confidential, I want to set some specific configuration on the sharing capabilities. I want to show or hide the group in Outlook. So I set all these settings, and then I can create the group. So to call the group, it's a basic graph API call with all the information filled in by the user. Then I will need to get my access token for my delegation permission, because they are not the same as the service principal access token. And then I will go through, first, I will configure the Office group. So some of the configuration can be done with Graph API calls. For example, all the Outlook related settings. You can also control the expiration policy with Graph, but for all the SharePoint settings, you can only do this with PowerShell. So I've created an Azure function that I can eventually show you. Right here. So this is a very basic function using PNP. Once it's started, I will show you. That set all the sharing capabilities and sharing option for members. So this is basic PowerShell in Azure. This is very interesting because you can do pretty much whatever you want on your SharePoint site as a template using this approach. Let's go back to the flow. So once the group is configured, I will start parsing my template. So in my templates, I have 3 columns of JSON, which are basically multiple line of text in SharePoint. And for example, in my test template, I will define that I will need one resource, which is a plan. So I will specify all the information here. For example, I need a plan in Planner. This is the name of my plan, and this is the template I use to create tasks. So basically, my flow is parsing all this information. It will create the plan, and it will duplicate the plan if needed, the template plan if needed. Once the resources are provisioned, we can go to the Teams creation. So you can see here that we have a retry because we sometimes have bad gateways, and we just have to re-execute the graph call. So this is a way to deal with those errors. So we just create the teams, and then we can start creating the channel. So on the same way to do this, we have on the template item all the channel that needs to be created. So I have my channel for a specific topic and my private channel as well. By default, you will add the requester as the owner of the private channel. And then the flow will move on and just configure the tabs. So we can here have different kind of tabs. So for example, the first one here was the SharePoint page or list tab. And the second one should be the planner. I can see it, SharePoint list. And the second one, yeah, is the planner. So basically on the tab here, I have different kind of tabs, SharePoint page list and planner. This is where I made an association with my resource. So the plan resource at the ID 1, I use it here to specify that in that tab, I want to show up the first resources provided. And here, for example, I just specified that I want to put in my tab configuration SharePoint page that is accessible for the whole company, which is the Office 365 e-learning center. So basically, the flow will parse all these templates information and create the tabs and the teams accordingly. And then it will just add the different members and owners to the team. So let me execute this another time with another template. So you will see that there's a lot of things possible. Let's create a core project. Just forgot to show you that now that the team is created, my application knows that I already have a test team. So I don't have the ability to create a new test team. I just have the ability to go directly to my team. This is not going to work. I'm not on the same tenant. So it points me out directly into my test team that I already have created. Let's create, for example, I would say a project which is going to be confidential. I will be able to add few members. I will put this as public so I can share externally. Project for Teams Fest, and here I have the ability to choose my own email address. I have different options within Outlook, and I can start a creation. I think you have pretty much the whole overview. I've seen that we have a few questions in the chat, so I will try to answer before it's time. So if user create a list item in SharePoint, it trigger a flow that use Prem connector. Would the user need to have a Power Up license? You probably mean a flow license. So about flow licensing, first of all, the Power Apps licensing. Every user that consume a Power Apps needs to have a Power Apps license and access to the data source. So all my users will need to have access to my SharePoint site where I store all the requests. Then from a flow perspective, as my flow is triggered automatically when a new item is used, that means this flow is not started based on a user action, meaning only the flow that only the account that has created the flow needs a premium license to perform operation, and this operation within the flow are not going to be made with the identity of the person who created the item in SharePoint, but with the identity of the account who is listening to the SharePoint list. So this is why I only need one premium license for Flow. If you use, for example, Flow behind the button in Power Apps, that means that the flow is not launched automatically. It is launched by a user request. So the users that click that button in Power Apps will be the one executing the flow. That means this user will need a premium license as well if the flow is using premium connectors. So this is why we store all the information in SharePoint list first, and then we start a flow based on this SharePoint list new item listener. Of course, Logic App can be used here because the HTTP connector is included within Logic Apps, but you need to compare the costs, because the Logic Apps that listen to the SharePoint list will trigger every minute, for example, and even if there is no action made after the trigger, you will be billed for the trigger used. So I would say that you just have to compare how many teams are going to be created through your app per month, for example, just in order to have an overview of the costs and see if it's cheaper to do this with Logic Apps or with Flow. I can see how we can share this flow. This flow is still using some of Azure capability, as I said, Azure Function, Azure Key Vault. So I will see how I can share this. Cool. Let me know if you have any question in the chat, or even by unmuting you. Just here you will have few resources to learn how to do this. Laura Kokarinen has a wonderful blog where she explained everything about tabs configuration through Graph API, and also she have all the resources needed to create delegation permissions, and she provided a flow that just duplicates the planner, just like I did. So the flows that duplicate planner bucket and tasks is provided on Git. Then you have this blog for all the SharePoint configuration through the Azure function, and obviously you have the reference of Graph API on Microsoft.com, which provide all the information about your Graph requests and the permission needed to perform that request. You have today in that same room a lot of information about Graph, so you can easily see how people can create a permission to perform Graph calls and so on the different session we had here. Yeah, just I will prepare a shareable version of the flow without any secrets and with some comments eventually. So feel free to reach me out on Twitter or LinkedIn so I can share what I've done. You have just here all my contact information. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and feel free to reach me out whenever you want. If you have any question about provisioning or graph calls or Power Apps or so on. Thank you.